Thank you, Zara, for the introduction. My name is Lauren McNeill, and I am a registered dietitian who specializes in plant-based nutrition. Thank you. So I thought I'd share a little bit about myself before I get started because it is kind of uncommon. So I am a clinically trained registered dietitian, which basically means that I worked primarily in a hospital before this. I got my training in a hospital, all that kind of stuff. But after that time, I realized that I wanted to focus a little bit more heavily on preventative care and specifically plant-based nutrition. So I decided to pursue a Master's of Public Health from the University of Toronto in Nutrition and Dietetics with a collaborative specialization in women's health and kind of a personalized specialization in plant-based nutrition. I've been personally interested in plant-based nutrition for probably about the past 8 years in doing my own studies, but it wasn't until I had the opportunity to work with Dr. David Jenkins to validate the then proposed changes to Canada's food guide to promote Canadians to consume more plant-based protein that I was really able to merge these personal and professional interests. I also had the opportunity to work with Dr. Pamela Ferguson, who previously was a vegan registered dietitian in Toronto, and she really encouraged me to start a private practice. So I decided to do that, and now I'm happy to say that private practice is my primary job, and I like to say that I see everyone from those who are vegan or vegetarian to those simply wanting to incorporate more plant-based foods into their everyday eating patterns. I also have a social media account called Tasting to Thrive _RD, where I share plant-based recipes, plant-based nutrition tips, and lifestyle things with my audience of over 32,000 followers. Thank you. So it's a really great mix for me for being able to work one-on-one with clients and then also disseminate my message to a much wider audience. So these are some of my conflicts of interest. I do have the opportunity to collaborate with some brands that I feel align with my messaging and my interests, and these are one-off collaborations and usually focus around sharing plant-based recipes or evidence-based nutrition information. Okay, so let's get into today's objectives. So I'm hoping that we can understand the benefits of eating a plant-based diet, although to be honest, our other speakers have done a really, really great job of doing that, so I'm just going to touch briefly on it. And then I also want to debunk some of the most common myths surrounding plant-based diets, particularly protein, calcium, vitamin B12, omega-3, iron, and soy consumption, to hopefully gain a better understanding of how to follow a well-planned and diverse plant-based diet. So why plant-based? Typically when clients come to see me, they're motivated by one or more of these 3 reasons for starting a plant-based diet, and these are animal welfare reasons, environmental reasons, and health reasons. Animal welfare is relatively self-explanatory, with our current food system heavily promoting factory farming. In 2017, Canada alone slaughtered over 3 million cattle and calves, over 600,000 pigs, and over 21 million sheep and lamb, and over 600 million chickens. In terms of the environmental aspects, this is becoming more and more prevalent, especially in the news today. Animal agriculture accounts for over 72 to 78% of total agricultural greenhouse gas emissions, with beef, pork, and poultry producing 39.3 and 4.3 kilograms of greenhouse gas emissions per kilogram of product, respectively. Greenhouse gas emissions per kilogram of protein from beef and lamb are 250 times those produced from legumes, and 40 times higher in pork and poultry than in legumes. And lastly, the biggest reason that people come to see me concerning following a plant-based diet is health reasons, which makes sense because I'm a registered dietitian. So 3 in 5 annual deaths globally are attributed to 4 major non-communicable diseases, which are cardiovascular disease, cancer, diabetes, and chronic lung disease. These are primarily caused by 4 main factors, which are poor diet, physical inactivity, tobacco use, and alcohol consumption. The foods that are most commonly linked time and time again to disease reduction are whole grains, legumes, fruits, and vegetables. Vegan diets come closer to meeting dietary guidelines for total fat, saturated fat, trans fat, dietary cholesterol, and fiber intake than any other dietary group. Some of the other speakers talked a little bit about blue zones already, but these are basically areas of the world that are studied for their longevity. All of these areas consume a 90 to 100% plant-based diet, and they also engage in a myriad of other very beneficial factors like increased physical activity, low tobacco use, and increased social engagement. In terms of cardiovascular disease, our speakers have already talked a lot about these specific diseases pertaining to plant-based diets, but the EPIC Oxford showed that vegetarians had a 28% reduced risk of developing ischemic heart disease compared to those who follow omnivorous diets. Vegetarians and vegan have a 43 to 63% reduced risk of developing hypertension than omnivores. When 17 different types of cancers were studied, plant-based diets were shown to be protective against 14 of them. I think we all know colorectal cancer to be studied heavily in terms of a plant-based diet, and particular studies have shown that in those who have low dietary fiber intake, with just a 10-gram increase in fiber coincides with a 10% reduced risk of colorectal cancer. These beneficial effects are usually due to their phytochemical, antioxidant, and fiber compounds in the food. In terms of diabetes, vegan and near-vegan diets have been shown time and time again to reduce risk of developing type 2 diabetes, especially when we're considering things like oats, barley, psyllium husks, flax seeds, nuts, and seeds for their beneficial effects on blood cholesterol, oxidative stress, and blood glucose. So there's a lot of evidence supporting following a plant-based diet, but there's still so many myths surrounding following it. So I'm hoping to debunk some of those myths with you today. The first myth is protein. Now, it wouldn't be a talk about common myths surrounding plant-based diets if I didn't touch on protein. If I had a dime for every single time someone asked me about this, I would be a millionaire. But to be honest, I actually really encourage the question. This is because so many of us grew up in a time where it's been heavily promoted to us that protein can only come from animal-based sources, but this simply isn't the case. I decided to do a little bit of a poll on my social media, seeing how many people actually believed some of the myths that I'm sharing with you today. I want to make it abundantly clear that this is in no way a scientific study. This is purely just anecdotal evidence, but I thought it might bring a little bit of life to the presentation. But it's also important to remember that most of the people who follow me are very likely at least interested in plant-based diets because that's what I share about every single day. So of the followers who took part in my poll, 28% said they thought it would be hard to get enough protein on a plant-based diet, and 42% said they thought it would be hard to get good quality protein on a plant-based diet. So amino acids are the building blocks of protein, and I think we all know that they are a component of muscle and bone, but they also have so many other jobs in our body that we rarely talk about. They protect our health in the form of antibodies and other immune systems. They accomplish reactions as enzymes, and they coordinate activities as hormones, carry oxygen throughout our bodies, so they are very important. There are 20 amino acids, 9 of which are essential. All 9 of these essential amino acids can be found in plants. So it makes very little sense to assume that we have to eat animal products in order to get them. There are 2 amino acids that are of kind of particular concern to some people who follow plant-based diets, and these are lysine and methionine. Lysine can be found abundantly in things like legumes and seeds, but relatively low in things like whole grains. In contrast, whole grains are very high in methionine, but relatively low in things like lysine. It was previously thought that in order to get that full spectrum of amino acids, that we would have to pair legumes and whole grains at every single meal in order to ensure that we were getting the full spectrum of amino acids, but we now know that this actually isn't the case. Our body is able to store pools of amino acids throughout the day, and so if we're eating a meal that's relatively low in one of those amino acids, then we can draw on those pools later in the day to do those functions that I've already talked to you about. There are the other common myths surrounding plant-based diet, which is getting enough protein. Many people think that we need a lot more protein than we actually do. In actual fact, we need about 0.8 grams per kilogram of protein of body weight, and some studies have shown a slight increase to 0.83 grams per kilogram of body weight might be beneficial, and an even more slight increase to 0.9 grams per kilogram of body weight for those who follow a plant-based diet. But regardless, this is very, very easy to get on a plant-based diet. For someone who is 150 pounds, this would mean that you need about 60 grams of protein per day, which is very, very easy. I always encourage clients to make about a quarter of their plate plant-based protein, which I've tried to visualize here. These are some of the pictures from my Instagram account. And these can come from anywhere from beans, lentils, other legumes, tofu, tempeh, nuts, seeds, nut and seed butters, quinoa. All of these are abundant in plant-based protein. I've had some clients who have been worried about the amount of protein that they're consuming in a day, so I encourage them to log their intake for just a couple days to see where they're at. Most of the time, they're absolutely amazed to see that they are actually getting more than enough protein that they even need, and I've actually never had a client who is getting less than the amount of protein that they need on a whole foods, plant-based diet. This is all to say that as long as you are consuming enough calories for your body and you are consuming a well-planned and diverse plant-based diet full of things like legumes, whole grains, vegetables, fruit, nuts, and seeds, protein will not be an issue for you. Okay, so the next big one is calcium. I think we all kind of equate calcium to cow's milk, right? So of the people who took part in my poll, 35% said they were concerned about getting enough calcium on a plant-based diet. So yes, there is no question that dairy can be a good source of calcium, vitamin D, and protein, but these can also be found in abundance in other plant foods as well. In particular, we can contrast 1 cup of soy milk has the same amount of calcium, vitamin D, and only very, very slightly less protein than 1 cup of cow's milk. Most plant-based milks that you get in the refrigerated section of the grocery store will be fortified with calcium and vitamin D. So I think we all know that calcium is really important for giving hardness to bones and teeth, but 1% of calcium in our body is actually used for nerve cell transmission, muscle relaxation, and a bunch of other things. So it is definitely important to ensure that we are getting enough calcium. With that being said, many people consider calcium to be the #1 important factor in maintaining and building bone structure, and basically the only thing that matters. And although it does play an extremely important role, it is not the only thing that matters. Osteoporosis is actually an interplay of many different things. Although calcium is important to bone health, there are tons of other things that also affect bone health that are both modifiable and unmodifiable risk factors. Unmodifiable risk factors are things like family history, age, gender, ethnicity, and then things that are modifiable risk factors are things like poorly planned diet, physical inactivity, sun exposure, alcohol consumption, caffeine consumption, and sodium consumption. Because of this, it is important to ensure that we are engaging in all of these other factors to help to maintain bone health. Some studies have been done and they show that those who follow a vegan diet may have an increased risk of bone fracture. However, the important thing to remember with these studies is they often don't include vegans who have fortified food in their intake and aren't consuming enough calcium. Other studies that have been done on vegans that consume the same amount of calcium as those who follow omnivorous diets show that vegans actually do not have an increased risk of bone fracture. So there are many important factors to think about when trying to prevent against osteoporosis, and calcium is just one of them. We also want to make sure that our alcohol consumption isn't too elevated, same with caffeine and sodium as well. And we also need to be cognizant of other nutrients like vitamin D, magnesium, and phosphorus, as these can all play a role in bone health. So the foods that are particularly high in plant-based calcium are things like your dark leafy greens like kale, napa cabbage, bok choy, broccoli, beans, and then certain nuts and seeds, so things like almonds, almond butter, sesame seeds, and tahini, and also those fortified foods that we talked about, so things like calcium-fed tofu, and then fortified plant-based milks can all be abundant in calcium. I've had clients who have doubled their calcium intake by simply adding things like kale to their morning smoothie, adding a cup of plant-based milk to their day, adding beans to their lunch, and adding almond butter and tahini throughout the day. The takeaway here is that it is important to be cognizant of the amount of calcium that we're consuming, but it's not something to be too concerned about when following a well-planned and diverse plant-based diet. We also need to be cognizant of other things like physical activity, especially weight-bearing physical activity, and other nutrients like vitamin D that may affect bone health. So the next one is vitamin B12. So, of the followers who took part in my poll, 58% said they were concerned about getting enough vitamin B12 on a plant-based diet, but only 35% were taking a vitamin B12 supplement. The biggest reason for this were lack of knowledge concerning the need to take a vitamin B12 supplement, relying on fortified food for vitamin B12 supplementation, and just forgetting to take the supplement. So lack of vitamin B12 can lead to many adverse health effects that may be associated with kind of the negative implications of starting a vegan diet. Vitamin B12 is required for DNA synthesis and red blood cell synthesis, particularly for bone marrow. And vitamin B12 actually helps to rid the body of homocysteine, which is a potentially harmful breakdown product of protein that in excessive amounts may lead to cardiovascular disease. So with this being said, it is very, very important to make sure that we're getting enough vitamin B12. A lot of people who are kind of against the vegan movement will say that because vitamin B12 is the nutrient that can't be made in adequate amounts by the body, can't be found in adequate amounts in plant-based foods, this must mean that the vegan diet is unnatural, but this fails to recognize that animals actually get the B12 from bacteria in the soil, and more increasingly these days, their feed is actually fortified with vitamin B12 due to our depleted soil. So our bodies do create a little bit of vitamin B12 in our gut, but this is not enough to rely upon. Some people rely on fortified food for vitamin B12 intake, but I actually don't recommend this because the amount that we eat on a day-to-day basis, and especially the amount of fortified food that we eat, varies from day to day. Instead, I always recommend that clients take a vitamin B12 supplement in order to make sure that you are meeting your needs. I've had many clients who have reported feeling very tired and lethargic on a plant-based diet, and once I've realized that they're not taking a vitamin B12 supplement, and once we get one of those in them, they've seen drastic improvements in their energy levels within just a matter of months, basically. It's important to remember with this that it can take months or even years to see a vitamin B12 deficiency on a blood work, so we need to be very cognizant that we're getting enough vitamin B12, taking a supplement kind of regardless of what our blood work is saying, because the negative implications of having low levels of vitamin B12 can start before we even see the deficiency on the blood work. omega-3. So this is a big one about a plant-based diet, and many people think that omega-3 can only be obtained from fish. So, of the followers who took part in my poll, 53% said that they were concerned about getting enough omega-3 on a plant-based diet. So the body is able to produce all fatty acids it needs, aside from two. These are omega-3 and omega-6. Both omega-3 and omega-6 are very, very important for the inflammatory responses in our body, so we do need both of them. However, omega-3 in particular, the breakdown products of omega-3, which are EPA and DHA, have been shown to protect against cardiovascular disease, have beneficial effects on brain and eye health, they're anti-inflammatory, and they prevent chronic inflammation in our body, so they are especially important to make. ALA is the precursor to EPA and DHA. So we need to be consuming that ALA in order to ensure that our body can make that EPA and the DHA. So there are two very important things that I consider when I'm working with clients in order to ensure that they are going to be able to make enough EPA and DHA. The first of which is to make sure that you're getting that omega-3, the ALA. We can get these from ground flax seeds, hemp, chia, walnuts, flax and hemp oil, and I encourage clients to get about 2 to 3 tablespoons of this per day in order to make sure we're getting enough so we can make that EPA and DHA. Some studies have shown that the conversion of ALA into EPA and DHA might be relatively weak and inconsistent, so we do need to make sure that we're getting enough of that ALA in order to support our bodies in breaking it down. The other really important factor in ensuring that we're able to form enough EPA and DHA is that we're not getting too much omega-6. This is because omega-6 competes for the desaturation enzymes in our body that might stop us from breaking down into EPA and DHA, which is where all the benefits are. So our body typically favors ALA in this desaturation process, which is a good thing, but if we have too much omega-6, then that omega-6 breakdown will be favored. I typically recommend clients to get about a 2-to-1 ratio of omega-6 to omega-3, and sometimes up to 4-to-1 depending, but the typical Western diet actually has about a 10-to-1 up to a 50-to-1 ratio of omega-6 to omega-3. So we actually have a long way to go there. This is because a lot of omega-6 is found in processed foods, things like processed salad dressings, margarines, cookies, cakes, desserts, things like that, and also things like safflower oil, sunflower oil, corn oil, and sesame oil. So I do encourage clients to reduce their intake of that in order to make sure that their body is able to make enough EPA and DHA. Some people might benefit from taking a supplement that has DHA in them, and with EPA, a lot of them have both in them, but that's something that I would need to kind of evaluate on a 1-to-1 basis. So the takeaway here is the two mechanisms to make sure that you're getting enough EPA and DHA are first to make sure that you're consuming enough ALA-rich foods like your ground flax seeds, chia seeds, walnuts, hemp hearts, and also to watch the amount of omega-6 rich foods that you're consuming as well. The next big one is iron, and I think a lot of people assume that we can only get iron from animal-based foods. Of the people who took part in my poll, 57% said they were concerned about getting enough iron on a plant-based diet. So it's a common myth that iron deficiency anemia only occurs in vegans and vegetarians, but studies have actually shown that iron deficiency anemia occurs just as commonly in those who consume omnivorous diets as those who consume whole food plant-based diets. Iron is a constituent of red blood cells, and it plays a role in transporting oxygen throughout our body and kind of carrying away the metabolic waste products in our body. So it is really important that we are making sure we're getting enough. And if we don't have enough iron, we can feel those kind of typical anemic symptoms, like feeling really tired and lethargic. We've been led to believe that iron can only be found in animal products, but this actually isn't the case. There are two different types of iron, which are heme iron and non-heme iron. Heme iron is typically found in animal-based foods, whereas non-heme iron is typically found in plant-based foods. It is true that heme iron is more readily absorbed by the body. However, this might not always be a good thing. Some studies have shown that elevated levels of heme iron in our body might lead to things like increased risk of Alzheimer's disease, Parkinson's disease, and type 2 diabetes. And this might be because our body is not able to regulate how much heme iron we are absorbing from our food. In contrast, we can regulate the amount of non-heme iron that we are absorbing from our food, meaning that if we have too high levels of iron in our body, we will decrease the amount that we are absorbing, but if we have too low levels, then we will increase the amount that we are absorbing. Some other studies have shown that those who follow a plant-based diet might have low levels of ferritin, which are our storage forms of iron in the body. But it's not very clear that having high levels of ferritin is actually a good thing, especially if you're someone who consumes iron-rich sources on a daily basis, which we all should be, because high levels of ferritin might lead to insulin sensitivity and type 2 diabetes. So I always encourage clients to get iron-rich foods with most of their meals. These are things like dark leafy greens like kale, Napa cabbage, bok choy, broccoli, beans, legumes such as lentils and black beans are amazing sources of plant-based iron. Certain whole grains like oatmeal and certain seeds like pumpkin seeds are all going to be really, really good sources of plant-based iron. We also can do a few other things with our diet to make sure that we're actually getting those good amounts of iron. The first of which is pairing iron-rich foods with foods that's rich in vitamin C. So studies have shown that pairing just 50 milligrams of vitamin C, which is about the amount in half a bell pepper, with iron-rich foods increases the amount of iron that we're absorbing 6-fold. So this is really great. Vitamin C-rich foods are things like, of course, citrus fruits, lemons, limes, strawberries, cantaloupes, kiwis, broccoli, bell peppers. These are all rich in vitamin C. We can also soak or sprout our things like whole grains and legumes in order to increase the bioavailability of iron in our food. And we also might want to be cognizant of the amount of things like red wine, coffee, tea, because of their tannins and polyphenols that we're consuming with our food, because these might decrease the amount of iron that we're absorbing from our food. So I always encourage clients to have things like coffee or red wine about an hour spaced away from meals to make sure that they're getting the maximum absorption in our food. So the main takeaway here is that as long as you are consuming a well-planned and diverse plant-based diet filled with these foods, you should have no problem getting enough iron. I've had tons of clients who have drastically improved their iron intake by just adding things like dark leafy greens to their meals, incorporating lentils, and pairing things with vitamin C, rich foods as well. So last but certainly not least, we have soy. So there's a huge misconception, and I would say about 70% of the clients that come to see me, that's just a ballpark guess, about soy. And of the followers who took part in my poll, 29% said they were concerned about consuming soy for health reasons. Soybeans contain phytoestrogens called isoflavones that can bind to estrogen receptor sites. However, plant-based estrogens are not the same as human estrogens and have much weaker activity. Furthermore, plant-based estrogens are selectives in the estrogen sites that they bind to, which determines whether they have a very weak estrogen-like activity in our body or an anti-estrogen-like activity in our body. Recent research has actually shown that isoflavones act on reproductive cells like breast or uterus tissue and have anti-estrogen-like activities, and they bind to bone tissue and have slight estrogen-like activity. Both of these things are actually very, very beneficial to our health. Studies have shown that in those who consume soy have a reduced risk of developing breast cancer and a reduced risk of breast cancer death. For the men out there, soy has actually been linked to reduced risk of developing prostate cancer and reduced prostate cancer cell growth. These are all at servings of about 2 to 3 servings of soy per day in the traditional soy foods like tofu, tempeh, edamame, and soy milk. So the main takeaway here is that soy is either beneficial for our health or maybe it doesn't have too much of an effect, but either way, servings of about 2 to 3 servings per day of traditional soy foods have been shown to be healthy and beneficial and a great source of protein. I couldn't really think of a client case study for this one in particular, so I just wanted to share that I have tons of male clients who come and see me, and none of them have reported getting man boobs from consuming soy. So the main takeaway here is that a well-planned and diverse plant-based diet can be highly nutritious. Sorry for that typo. I just wanted to reiterate that this is, of course, public health messaging, and if you are someone who thinks that they might need a bit of help one-on-one, please don't hesitate to reach out to me. You can find me on Instagram, tastingtothrive_RD. You can email me, Lauren at tastingtothrive. You can find me on my website, all that good stuff. And thank you so much, Zara and Shireen, for having me here and putting on this amazing conference.